March 2023. An 18-year-old woman from Washington State tells her family she's traveling to Mexico with someone she trusts. At first, the messages continue, a text here, a phone call there. Nothing seems completely out of the ordinary. Then suddenly, silence, no calls, no texts, no social media activity, no confirmed sightings. More than 3 years later, her family is still searching for answers. What happened to Shelbie Lynn Dwyer after she boarded a flight into one of Mexico's most dangerous regions? And why has nobody been able to bring her home? Tonight we examine the disappearance that crossed international borders and left a family trapped in an endless search for the truth. Subscribe CTA before we begin. If you enjoy detailed true crime investigations and real-life mysteries, subscribe to Real Crime Pulse and turn on notifications so you never miss a new case. In missing person cases, there is often a moment when everything changes. A moment that seems ordinary at the time but later becomes impossible to forget. A final conversation, a last goodbye, a simple plan that never unfolds the way it was supposed to. For the family of Shelbie Lynn Dwyer, that moment arrived in the spring of 2023. What began as a trip away from home would eventually become an international missing person investigation spanning thousands of miles and involving authorities from 2 countries. But before Shelbie became the subject of FBI bulletins and reward posters, she was simply a young woman with a family who loved her and a future that still seemed wide open. Shelbie Lynn Dwyer lived in Des Moines, Washington, a coastal city located just south of Seattle. Like many teenagers entering adulthood, she was navigating an important transition in life. At only 18 years old, she was standing at the point where childhood was fading into independence. Friends and family knew her as a young woman with her own personality, interests, and plans for the future. Those who knew Shelbie best remembered more than the details listed on missing person posters. They remembered the person behind the photographs. They remembered her smile, her voice, and the small moments that make someone irreplaceable. For her family, Shelbie was not a headline or a case number. She was a daughter, a loved one, and a central part of their lives. Physically, Shelbie stood 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed approximately 100 pounds. She had brown hair and brown eyes. Distinctive tattoos helped make her easily recognizable. A rose tattoo appeared on her right hand. Another design was located on her right middle finger. On her right forearm, the word "blessed" was tattooed in decorative cursive writing. Years later, those details would become critical identifiers used by investigators and search efforts hoping to locate her. In the months before her disappearance, nothing publicly suggested that Shelbie was about to become the focus of an international search. She was a young woman living her life surrounded by people who cared about her. Like many families, the Dwyers experienced the normal ups and downs of daily life. There were conversations about plans, responsibilities, and the future. There were ordinary routines that seemed permanent simply because nobody expected them to end. One of the strongest bonds in Shelbie's life was her connection with her family, especially her mother. Later interviews would reveal the heartbreak that followed when communication suddenly stopped. Those interviews also showed something else. They revealed how deeply Shelbie was loved and how determined her family would become in their search for answers. As 2023 began, there was no indication that the coming months would bring uncertainty, fear, and years of unanswered questions. Like countless young adults, Shelbie was exploring her independence and making decisions about where she wanted to go and who she wanted to spend time with. To those around her, many of those decisions appeared normal. Then came March. At some point during that month, plans were made for a trip south. According to investigators, Shelbie would eventually leave Washington and travel toward Mexico. Reports later indicated that she was making the journey with a man described as a trusted friend. At the time, there was little reason for family members to immediately assume danger. Young adults travel frequently, and Shelbie's departure did not initially trigger widespread alarm. What nobody knew was that the trip would soon take a series of unexpected turns. The journey would carry Shelbie hundreds of miles from home and eventually across an international border. Over the following days, her movements would become increasingly difficult to track. Communications with family would become sporadic. Questions would begin to emerge. And before long, those questions would grow into a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. For now, however, the story was only beginning. As March 2023 progressed, Shelbie packed for a trip that seemed temporary. Her family expected to hear from her again soon. They believed she would return home. Instead, they were about to begin a search that would cross borders, involve federal investigators, and leave them chasing answers for years to come. In the next chapter of this investigation, Shelbie leaves Washington and begins the road trip that would become the first step in a baffling disappearance. March 25, 2023, began like countless other days across the Pacific Northwest. In Des Moines, Washington, life moved at its usual pace. Cars filled local roads, businesses opened their doors, and families went about their routines without any reason to believe that one young woman was about to begin a journey that would eventually spark an international missing person investigation. On that day, 18-year-old Shelbie Lynn Dwyer voluntarily left the Des Moines area and headed south. According to investigators, she was traveling with a man who would later be described as a trusted friend. Publicly released information has not indicated that Shelbie was forced to leave, threatened, or coerced. From everything authorities have shared, the trip appeared to be voluntary. For her family, there was no immediate reason to panic. Young adults often travel with friends. Road trips can be spontaneous adventures, opportunities to explore new places, or simply a break from everyday life. While parents naturally worry whenever a child travels far from home, there was nothing publicly known at the time to suggest that Shelbie was heading toward danger. As the vehicle moved south, miles of highway separated her from Washington. The exact conversations that took place during the drive remain unknown. Investigators have not publicly released a complete itinerary of the trip, nor have they detailed every stop along the way. What is known is that Shelbie's journey would ultimately take her beyond the United States and into Mexico. Cross-border travel is common. Every year, millions of people move between the United States and Mexico for tourism, family visits, business, and recreation. For many travelers, crossing the border is uneventful, but in missing person investigations, every movement becomes important. Every destination becomes a potential clue. As Shelbie traveled, she remained in contact with family members, though not consistently. The communication was described later as sporadic. Sometimes family members would hear from her. At other times, there would be silence. While those gaps might seem concerning in hindsight, they did not immediately stand out as unusual. Many young travelers communicate irregularly while on the road, especially when they are focused on their trip. Still, the journey was becoming more complex than anyone initially realized. At some point after leaving Washington, Shelbie is believed to have arrived in Tijuana, Mexico. Located directly across the border from San Diego, Tijuana is one of the busiest border cities in the world. Every day, thousands of travelers move through the region. For investigators attempting to reconstruct a person's movements, such heavily traveled locations can present enormous challenges. The FBI would later identify Tijuana as a significant point in Shelbie's known travel timeline. However, many questions remain unanswered. What exactly was the purpose of the trip? How long was she planning to stay? What activities had been planned before leaving Washington? Public records released by investigators have not provided complete answers. For Shelbie's family, however, those details became increasingly important as time passed. As days went by, they continued receiving occasional communication from her. Those messages offered reassurance that she was still traveling and still reachable. Yet beneath that reassurance, uncertainty was beginning to grow. Family members naturally wanted updates. They wanted to know where she was and when she would be returning home. At that stage, nobody could have predicted that each message was becoming more valuable than the last. Missing person investigations often hinge on timelines. Detectives work backward from the last confirmed contact, analyzing phone records, travel records, surveillance footage, and witness accounts. In Shelbie's case, those final days of communication would eventually become some of the most scrutinized moments of the entire investigation. The further she traveled from Washington, the more difficult it became for loved ones to understand exactly where she was. Information came in pieces rather than a complete picture. There were updates, but not enough to fully explain her movements. Family members remained hopeful that she was simply enjoying her trip and would soon return. Meanwhile, Shelbie continued moving deeper into Mexico. What appeared to be a straightforward road trip was quietly transforming into something far more complicated. Investigators would later discover that the journey did not end in Tijuana. Instead, evidence suggested that Shelbie's travels were continuing farther south, toward a region that would later become central to the mystery. The road trip that began in Washington was leading somewhere unexpected, and as the days passed, Shelbie's family remained unaware that the most critical phase of her journey was still ahead. Soon, her path would take an unexpected turn involving airports, connecting flights and a destination that would ultimately become the last place investigators believe she was ever seen. In the next chapter, the messages continue from Mexico, but growing gaps in communication begin raising concerns as Shelbie's movements become increasingly difficult to trace. For families separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles, communication becomes a lifeline. A simple text message can provide reassurance. A quick phone call can ease worry. Even a brief update can remind loved ones that everything is okay. During the days following Shelbie Lynn Dwyer's departure from Washington, those messages became the only connection between her and the family waiting for her return. At first, there was little reason to believe anything was wrong. Shelbie had voluntarily left home and was traveling in Mexico. While the distance naturally caused concern, family members still expected to hear from her. According to information later released by investigators, communication continued after she crossed into Mexico. However, those communications were described as sporadic rather than regular. Sometimes there would be updates, sometimes there would be silence. For a young traveler on the move, that pattern may not have seemed unusual. Travel schedules change, cell phone service can be inconsistent. International travel often creates communication delays. Family members had no way of knowing that they were approaching what would become the final documented chapter of Shelbie's known movements. As investigators later pieced together the timeline, Tijuana emerged as an important location in her journey. The bustling border city served as one of the last places where authorities could confidently place Shelbie before her travels became more difficult to reconstruct. From there, however, the picture becomes less clear. What exactly Shelbie was doing each day remains largely unknown to the public. Authorities have not released detailed accounts of her activities, meetings, or accommodations during this period. Like many active investigations, key information has remained confidential as investigators continue searching for answers. What is known is that communication with her family continued. Although not consistently, every message carried importance, every call mattered. At the time, those interactions likely felt routine. Family members may have expected many more conversations to come. Looking back, however, each communication would later become part of a timeline investigators would study repeatedly. For loved ones, uncertainty can be one of the most difficult parts of any missing person case. When communication becomes irregular, families often find themselves balancing concern with optimism. They hope there is a simple explanation for every missed call. They tell themselves the next message will arrive soon. That appears to have been the situation facing Shelbie's family. As March 2023 progressed, they continued waiting for updates. There was no public indication that anyone expected her to disappear completely. While communication was not constant, it had not stopped altogether. Yet something was changing. Days after leaving Washington, Shelbie's travel plans appeared to be evolving. Information later released by investigators suggested that her movements were becoming more extensive than originally anticipated. The journey was no longer limited to a road trip. The situation was beginning to shift. According to statements later shared by her mother, Shelbie had been expected to come home. That expectation offered comfort. It suggested that whatever adventures or plans she had pursued in Mexico were temporary. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of returning north toward Washington, evidence would later indicate that Shelbie continued traveling deeper into Mexico. At the time, family members likely had no way of understanding how significant that development would become. The challenge for investigators today is that much of this period remains surrounded by unanswered questions. Publicly available information provides only fragments of the larger story. Authorities know certain destinations. They know portions of the timeline. They know when communication occurred and when it stopped. What remains unknown is why events unfolded the way they did. As family members continued monitoring messages and waiting for updates, they had no reason to believe they were nearing the end of all contact. Then came the final days of March. Somewhere within those final days, communication grew increasingly limited. The messages that had connected Shelbie to home became fewer. The certainty that she was safe became harder to maintain. For investigators, these moments are critical. The final communications often provide the last verified glimpse into a missing person's circumstances. They can reveal location information, travel plans, emotional state, and potential risks. In Shelbie's case, those final communications would soon become the dividing line between what investigators know and what remains a mystery. Family members continued, expecting another call, another text, another update. Instead, silence was approaching, and according to the timeline later released by federal authorities, Shelbie's journey was about to take a dramatic turn involving airline travel, a stop in Guadalajara, and a destination in the state of Sinaloa. It would be a decision that transformed concern into alarm and ultimately became one of the most important developments in the entire investigation. In the next chapter, investigators trace Shelbie's believed flight path from Tijuana to Sinaloa, uncovering the final known movements before she vanished without a trace. By the final days of March 2023, Shelbie Lynn Dwyer's journey had already carried her far from the familiar surroundings of Des Moines, Washington. What began as a voluntary trip with a trusted friend had gradually become more difficult for her family to follow. Communication had become sporadic, details about her movements were limited, and uncertainty was beginning to grow. Then investigators uncovered a development that would dramatically change the direction of the case. Evidence later suggested that Shelbie's travels did not end in Tijuana. Instead, authorities believe she boarded an airplane and continued deeper into Mexico. According to information released by the FBI, Shelbie is believed to have traveled from Tijuana by air, stopping first in Guadalajara before ultimately arriving in Culiacán, the capital city of the Mexican state of Sinaloa. The discovery of that travel route would become one of the most important pieces of information in the entire investigation. For her family, the revelation was deeply troubling. Up until that point, there had been an expectation that Shelbie would eventually return home. Her mother later explained that Shelbie had planned on coming back. But somewhere along the way, those plans appeared to change. Instead of heading north toward Washington, she boarded a flight that carried her farther away. The question was simple: why? More than 3 years later, investigators have not publicly provided a complete answer. To understand why the flight raised concerns, it is important to understand the geography involved. Guadalajara is one of Mexico's largest cities and a major transportation hub. Thousands of passengers pass through its airport every day, connecting to destinations throughout the country. A layover there would not necessarily be unusual. What captured the attention of investigators was the final destination. Culiacán sits within the state of Sinaloa, a region that has long attracted international attention because of organized crime activity. While millions of law-abiding residents live and work throughout the region, Sinaloa's reputation has often been shaped by decades of cartel-related violence and criminal investigations. When authorities determined that Shelbie had likely traveled into Sinaloa, the urgency surrounding her disappearance increased significantly. Still, there is an important distinction investigators have consistently maintained. There is no publicly released evidence proving what happened to Shelbie after she arrived there. The destination alone does not explain her disappearance. It simply marks another point in the timeline. As investigators work to reconstruct her movements, they focused on travel records, communication records, and witness information. Each piece of evidence helped establish where Shelbie had been and when she had been there. Yet, despite those efforts, large portions of the story remain unknown. Who did she meet? Why did her plans change? What prompted the flight into Sinaloa? Those questions continue to hang over the investigation. For Shelbie's family, every new detail created both hope and frustration. On one hand, learning more about her route provided investigators with valuable information. On the other hand, each answer seemed to generate even more questions. The family's understanding of the situation was evolving rapidly. What had initially appeared to be a temporary trip was becoming something far more serious. As federal investigators became increasingly involved, attention turned toward Shelbie's final known locations. Authorities attempted to determine where she had gone after arriving in Sinaloa and who may have been with her. Those efforts eventually led investigators to another critical location, Guamúchil, a city located within the municipality of Salvador Alvarado in Sinaloa. Guamúchil would become the last area where authorities believe Shelbie was present. Exactly what occurred there remains one of the central mysteries of the case. The available evidence suggests that Shelbie reached the area sometime around March 29, 2023. Beyond that point, the timeline becomes increasingly uncertain. For investigators, this is often where missing person cases become most difficult. Travel records can show where someone went. Flight information can reveal movement between cities. But once a person's communications stop and reliable witnesses disappear, reconstructing events becomes exponentially harder. Every hour matters. Every lead matters. Every potential sighting becomes important. As March 2023 came to an end, Shelbie's family still hoped they would hear from her again. They had no way of knowing that the communications they had already received might be the last ones they would ever get. The flight into Sinaloa had changed everything. What appeared to be a simple travel decision would ultimately become the final confirmed phase of Shelbie's known journey. Investigators now had a destination, a timeline, and a growing sense that something had gone terribly wrong. In the next chapter, the investigation reaches its most critical moment as authorities focus on March 29, 2023, the day Shelbie's trail appears to end and all communication suddenly falls silent. March 29, 2023. For investigators working missing person cases, there is often a date that becomes permanently etched into every report, every interview, and every search effort. It is the date when a person's known timeline ends. The point where facts become uncertainty and certainty gives way to mystery. For Shelbie Lynn Dwyer, that date was March 29, 2023. Everything investigators have learned about her disappearance eventually leads back to that day. By then, Shelbie had traveled hundreds of miles from her home in Washington state. Authorities believe she had journeyed through Tijuana, boarded flights through Guadalajara, and ultimately arrived in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. Her family had continued receiving occasional communication during portions of the trip, holding on to the belief that she would eventually return home. But as March drew to a close, something changed. The messages stopped. The calls stopped. The connection that had linked Shelbie to her family suddenly disappeared. According to the FBI, Shelbie was last believed to have been in the area of Guamúchil, Sinaloa, on or around March 29, 2023. That location would become the final known point in her documented journey. Since that time, no confirmed communication from Shelbie has been publicly reported. For her family, the silence was unlike anything they had experienced before. At first, there may have been hope that a simple explanation existed. Phones lose service. Batteries die. Travel plans change unexpectedly. People sometimes go hours or even days without checking in. But as time passed, those explanations became harder to believe. Every unanswered call increased concern. Every day without contact raised new fears. Families of missing persons often describe the experience as living in a state of suspended reality. They cannot move forward because there are no answers. Yet they cannot return to normal life because every moment is consumed by uncertainty. For Shelbie's loved ones, that painful process was beginning. Investigators immediately focused on identifying the last verified traces of her movements. In modern missing person cases, digital evidence often plays a crucial role. Phone activity, travel records, electronic communications, and witness accounts can help establish a person's final known actions. In Shelbie's case, authorities worked to determine exactly where she had been, who she had been with, and what may have occurred during the final days of her trip. Publicly available information, however, remains limited. Investigators have not released detailed accounts of her final communications. They have not publicly disclosed the contents of messages, the identities of everyone she encountered, or any evidence indicating precisely what happened after she reached the Guamúchil area. That lack of information has fueled the mystery surrounding the case. What investigators know is relatively straightforward. Shelbie traveled to Mexico. She continued communicating with family. For a period of time, she was believed to have traveled into Sinaloa. Then communication ceased. What happened after that remains unknown. The disappearance presented immediate challenges for law enforcement. Unlike cases where a person vanishes close to home, Shelbie's trail extended across international borders. Multiple jurisdictions became involved. Evidence potentially existed in different cities, different states, and even different countries. Each new layer added complexity to the investigation. Meanwhile, her family faced the emotional reality of not knowing where she was or whether she was safe. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Still, there was no verified contact, no confirmed sightings, no public indication that Shelbie had voluntarily chosen to cut ties with her family. As the investigation expanded, authorities began appealing to the public for assistance. Detectives hoped someone might remember seeing her. Perhaps a witness had encountered her in an airport. Perhaps someone in Sinaloa had information that had not yet reached investigators. Every possibility had to be considered. Every lead had to be pursued. Yet despite those efforts, the mystery deepened. March 29th became more than just a date. It became a dividing line. Everything before it could be partially reconstructed through travel records and communications. Everything after it was clouded by uncertainty. For Shelbie's mother and family, the questions were relentless. Where was she? Who had seen her last? Why had communication suddenly ended? And most importantly, could she still be found? As authorities continued searching for answers, it became clear that locating Shelbie would require far more than a local investigation. The case had already crossed borders, and solving it would demand cooperation between agencies in both the United States and Mexico. The disappearance was no longer simply a family's concern, it was becoming an international search effort. In the next chapter, we examine the desperate actions taken by Shelbie's family as they launched a campaign to find her, refusing to let her name disappear despite the growing passage of time. When a loved one goes missing, families are often forced into a role they never expected to play. They become investigators, advocates, spokespersons, and search coordinators all at once. Every day becomes a mission to find answers. Every phone call carries the possibility of hope or heartbreak. For the family of Shelbie Lynn Dwyer, that reality began shortly after communication with her suddenly stopped in late March 2023. At first, there was disbelief. The silence did not make sense. Shelbie had been in contact with her family during portions of her trip. While those communications had become sporadic, they had not disappeared entirely. Then, without warning, there were no more messages, no more calls, no indication of where she was or what had happened. As concern turned into alarm, her family began taking action. Like many families facing a missing person crisis, they started by trying to retrace Shelbie's known movements. Every conversation was revisited. Every detail was examined. Family members searched for clues that might explain where she had gone or who she might have been with. But the challenges were overwhelming. Shelbie had disappeared in another country. The distance between Washington State and Sinaloa, Mexico, was measured not only in miles but also in jurisdictional boundaries, language differences, and investigative complexities. Information was harder to obtain. Leads were more difficult to verify. The search required coordination across international borders. For her family, the feeling of helplessness was immense. Each day without answers brought new fears. Yet despite the uncertainty, they refused to stop searching. Missing person cases often depend on public awareness. The more people who know a face, a name, or a story, the greater the chance that someone will come forward with information. Understanding this, Shelbie's family began working tirelessly to keep her case visible. They shared photographs, they distributed information, they spoke publicly about her disappearance. They encouraged anyone who might know something to come forward. Their efforts transformed a private family tragedy into a public search for answers. At the center of that effort was Shelbie's mother. Like countless parents of missing children and young adults, she found herself navigating an unimaginable reality. Every day began with the same unanswered questions. Every night ended without certainty. One statement from Shelbie's mother would become particularly significant. According to public reports, she explained that Shelbie had originally planned on coming home, but instead boarded a plane to Sinaloa. That detail highlighted one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Something had changed. Somewhere during the trip, Shelbie's plans appeared to shift dramatically. Investigators would later focus considerable attention on understanding that transition. For her family, however, the immediate priority remained finding her. As weeks passed, they continued pushing for attention and assistance. The case eventually gained broader visibility, attracting media coverage and public interest. News reports helped spread Shelbie's story beyond Washington state, reaching audiences across the United States and even internationally. Each article carried the same essential message: a young woman was missing, her family was searching, and someone, somewhere might have information. The emotional toll of such a search cannot be overstated. Families of missing persons often describe living between hope and fear. They hope every lead will provide answers. They fear every unanswered question may signal something worse. The uncertainty becomes a constant companion. For Shelbie's loved ones, that uncertainty stretched from days into months. Birthdays passed, holidays passed, milestones came and went. Still, there was no confirmed contact, yet her family continued fighting to keep her case active. They understood a painful truth about missing person investigations. Public attention often fades over time. New stories emerge. News cycles move on, but families cannot move on because their loved one is still missing. That reality motivated them to keep speaking out, to keep sharing Shelbie's photographs, to keep reminding people that the investigation was far from over. Eventually, their persistence helped draw increased involvement from federal authorities. The disappearance of Shelbie Lynn Dwyer was no longer being examined solely at the local level. The circumstances surrounding her travel into Mexico and her unexplained disappearance demanded broader resources and international cooperation. As a result, additional agencies became involved in the effort to locate her. The search was expanding. Investigators in the United States and Mexico were working together. New leads were being evaluated. New evidence was being reviewed, and federal authorities were preparing to launch a more comprehensive investigation into the mystery surrounding Shelbie's disappearance. For her family, that development offered a measure of hope. The search was no longer theirs alone. An international effort was beginning to take shape. But even with additional resources, solving the case would prove extraordinarily difficult. In the next chapter, we examine the FBI's investigation, the challenges of tracking a missing American in another country, and the continuing effort to uncover what happened to Shelbie Lynn Dwyer after March 29, 2023. By the time Shelbie Lynn Dwyer had been missing for weeks, investigators were facing a case unlike many others. This was no longer a disappearance confined to a single city or even a single state. The known timeline stretched from Washington state to Mexico, crossed multiple jurisdictions, and involved movements through several major locations before ending in uncertainty. As the search expanded, federal authorities became increasingly involved. The FBI's Seattle field office joined the investigation, working alongside the Des Moines Police Department, officials from the United States government and Mexican authorities. The goal was straightforward but enormously challenging: determine what happened to Shelbie after she traveled into Mexico and locate her as quickly as possible. From the beginning, investigators faced a difficult reality. Every missing person case depends on evidence. Detectives build timelines, verify sightings, analyze records, and follow leads. The stronger the evidence trail, the easier it becomes to reconstruct a person's final movements. But in Shelbie's case, much of that trail appeared to end in Sinaloa. Authorities knew that she had left Washington on March 25, 2023. They believed she traveled through Tijuana and later flew through Guadalajara before arriving in Culiacán. Investigators also believed she was in the area of Guamúchil around March 29, 2023. After that, the picture became far less clear. One of the greatest challenges in international missing person investigations is coordination. Information must often be shared between agencies operating under different legal systems, investigative procedures, and jurisdictions. Records may exist in multiple locations. Witnesses may be difficult to locate. Potential evidence can be scattered across hundreds of miles. For investigators, every lead required careful examination. Every reported sighting had to be evaluated. Every piece of information had to be verified. At the same time, Authorities had to distinguish between confirmed facts and assumptions. Public attention can generate tips, but not every tip proves reliable. Detectives must follow evidence rather than speculation, especially in cases that attract significant public interest. As months passed, the FBI continued working to reconstruct Shelbie's known movements and identify anyone who may have had contact with her during her final days. The agency also began releasing information. Publicly missing person posters featuring Shelbie's photographs circulated online and through law enforcement networks. Investigators highlighted her physical description, including her height, weight, hair color, eye color, and distinctive tattoos. These details were intended to help potential witnesses recognize her and provide information. The tattoos became especially important. Identifiers: a rose tattoo on her right hand, design on her right middle finger, and the word "blessed" tattooed in cursive on her right forearm. In cases where years pass without answers, distinctive markings can become crucial pieces of information. Investigators hope that someone who encountered the missing person may remember those details and come forward. But despite continued efforts, answers remained elusive. The disappearance of an American citizen in another country presents unique difficulties. Investigators may know where someone was last believed to be, but determining what happened afterward can be far more complicated. Travel records can only reveal so much. Communication records eventually reach their limit. Witnesses may not exist or may never be identified. These obstacles made Shelbie's case particularly challenging, yet authorities refused to close the investigation. Instead, they continued seeking public assistance. Years after Shelbie disappeared, the FBI reaffirmed its commitment to finding answers. Investigators emphasized that the case remained active and that information from the public could still play a critical role. That commitment was reflected in one of the most significant developments in the investigation: a reward. Federal authorities announced a reward for information leading to Shelbie's recovery, signaling that investigators believed valuable information could still be out there. The reward served two purposes. It encouraged people with knowledge of the case to come forward, and it reminded the public that Shelbie's disappearance remained unsolved. For her family, every renewed appeal represented hope. Hope that someone had seen something. Hope that a witness who had stayed silent might finally speak. Hope that a missing piece of the puzzle still existed somewhere. As time passed, however, the investigation remained defined by unanswered questions. Why did Shelbie continue traveling deeper into Mexico? Who was with her during her final days? What happened after she reached the Guamúchil area? And perhaps most importantly, where is Shelbie today? Investigators continued searching for those answers, but the passage of time only made the mystery more difficult to solve. Still, neither law enforcement nor Shelbie's family gave up. The case remained open, the search remained active, and public appeals continued. In the next and final chapter, we examine the years that followed Shelbie's disappearance, the FBI's increased reward, the lasting impact on her family, and the heartbreaking reality of living for years without answers. More than 3 years have passed since Shelbie Lynn Dwyer was last heard from. For most people, 3 years is enough time for countless life events. People graduate from school, careers begin, families grow, plans change, new memories are created. For the families of missing persons, however, time often feels different. The calendar continues moving forward, but emotionally they remain tied to the moment everything changed. Every birthday becomes a reminder. Every holiday brings another empty chair. Every passing year raises the same painful questions that existed on the first day. For Shelbie's family, those questions have never gone away. What happened to her after March 29, 2023? Where is she now? And will they ever receive the answers they have been seeking for years? As the investigation continued into 2024, 2025, and eventually 2026, authorities repeatedly emphasized that Shelbie's case remained active. Despite the passage of time, investigators had not forgotten her disappearance. Law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border continued reviewing information and encouraging the public to come forward with any potential leads. One of the most significant developments came in June 2026. The FBI announced that the reward for information leading to Shelbie's Recovery had been increased to $20,000. The decision reflected a continuing commitment to the investigation and a belief that someone may still possess critical information. Rewards are often used when investigators hope to generate new leads, encourage witnesses to come forward, or bring renewed public attention to a case that remains unresolved. For Shelbie's family, the increased reward represented more than just a number. It represented hope. Hope that renewed publicity would reach someone who knew something. Hope that information buried for years might finally surface. Hope that the search would not be forgotten. At the same time, the reward highlighted a difficult reality. Despite years of investigation, many of the most important questions remain unanswered. Authorities believe Shelbie traveled from Washington to Mexico. They believe she was in Tijuana. They believe she flew through Guadalajara and arrived in Culiacán. They believe she was in the Guamúchil area around March 29, 2023. After that point, the trail becomes uncertain. There have been no publicly confirmed communications, no publicly confirmed sightings, no publicly released explanation for what happened next. That uncertainty is what makes missing person cases uniquely heartbreaking. In homicide investigations, families may eventually receive answers through arrests, trials, and convictions. Those outcomes cannot erase the loss, but they can provide some measure of understanding. In unresolved disappearances, there is often no such certainty. Families live with what experts sometimes call ambiguous loss, the painful experience of not knowing whether a loved one is alive, in danger, or gone forever. It is a type of grief that has no clear ending because there is no clear answer. For Shelbie's mother and loved ones, that uncertainty has become part of everyday life. Yet throughout the years, they have continued speaking about Shelbie and advocating for the investigation. Their determination has helped keep her story in the public eye, long after many cases would have faded from attention. That persistence matters. Many missing person cases are ultimately solved because someone remembers a detail years later. A witness comes forward. A forgotten lead is revisited. New information changes the direction of an investigation. For that reason, law enforcement continues urging anyone with information to contact authorities. Even the smallest detail could be important. Even a memory that seems insignificant could help investigators better understand Shelbie's final movements. As we reach the end of this story, one fact remains unchanged. Shelbie Lynn Dwyer is still missing. She was only 18 years old when she disappeared. She left home expecting to return. Her family expected to hear from her again. Instead, they were left with years of unanswered questions and an empty space that can never truly be filled. Behind every missing person poster is a real human life. Behind every FBI bulletin is a family waiting for a phone call, and behind every unresolved case is someone who deserves to be found. For Shelbie's loved ones, the search continues, the hope continues, and the belief that answers are still out there continues as well. Until those answers are found, Shelbie Lynn Dwyer's story remains one of the most troubling unsolved disappearances connected to both the United States and Mexico. A mystery defined not by what investigators know, but by what remains unknown. If you have any information regarding Shelbie Lynn Dwyer's disappearance, contact the appropriate authorities. And if you enjoy true crime documentaries, subscribe to Real Crime Pulse and turn on notifications for more real investigations.